the Share Your Insight podcast. My name is Bri, and I'm so glad that we have an amazing guest with us today named Dr. Paul Copan. Dr. Paul Copan is an apologist, a theologian, an ethicist, a philosopher, and of course, my professor here at PBA. So he bears multiple hats. I'm sure there's many more. He's got a lot of ministry experience. He's done a lot of on-the-ground work with ethics, but also a ton of academic work. I have a lot of your books, actually. Just got an Amazon gift card, so I was like, well, I'm going to get that one biblical ethics book by Dr. Copan. So really thankful that we could interview you today, Dr. Copan. But I'm looking forward to hearing kind of your heart behind these questions that we have on ethics. Would you like to introduce yourself to the viewers or the listeners of Share Your Insight?
Sure. I'm glad to be with you. Thanks, Brianna, for your inviting me. And I'm, as mentioned, a professor here at PBA, teach philosophy, ethics, and theology, and have a PhD in philosophy, but also have degrees in biblical studies, theology, and so on. So and so I'm often speaking in the area of ethics and moral thought, and so I'm glad to talk about some of the applications here as we discuss that today.
Well, thank you for wanting to share your perspective and some of your thoughts behind these questions. As you know, a lot of the listeners are young adults, and so we are in an age where young adults are kind of going in a pretty lost direction and kind of going with, rather than going with what's right, they're going with what feels right for them in that moment. A lot of the times, there's a lot of moral relativism going on in our world today, in our American culture. The topic of ethics is not always one that's easy to engage in. And so I wanted to ask for, especially the listeners who may not be familiar with what the term ethics is, how do you define ethics in very simple terms? If a kid asked you, like, what is ethics? How would you respond?
Ethics has to do with right and wrong, duties, obligations, what kind of character we ought to be. So when you think of do this, don't do that, more than just, don't eat dinner at this hour, eat it at that hour, or don't snack right now. Those are not really so much ethics issues, although they can be. But it's more in terms of you ought to be kind to that person. You ought not to murder. You ought not to take what doesn't belong to you. So very, very basic things that are part of our everyday lives. We're making ethical decisions every day. How should I spend my money? Am I wasting my money? Am I wasting my time? So that will also figure into various ways in which my life is taking shape. What kind of choices do I make? So will I lie about my age when I go into a movie theater? Will I take something from the store when I should be paying for it? So we're making ethical decisions. So we can't escape ethics, matters of right and wrong. In fact, even on the playground, one writer said, C.S. Lewis, he said, even on the playground, kids understand, hey, you cut in front of me, I was here first, or stop picking on him, he wasn't bothering you. Basic things from the very beginning. We start to see issues of fairness and unfairness. Hey, you shouldn't do that, or you ought to do that. And in our society, we say you ought to be tolerant, you ought to be fair-minded or open-minded. These are the sorts of things that relate to ethics. What you ought to do, what you ought not to do, what kind of character you should become.
Right. That's great to know. That's great to hear. And I think that that's a very memorable definition, a really understandable way to define ethics. So are there any particular concerns that you have as a professor? Do you see young adults at times go in directions that are dangerous, not only for themselves, but for those around them? And do you have any particular examples?
Sure. I remember you mentioned the topic of relativism, the idea that the truth can be, for one person, what might be true for one person isn't true for another, and so on. Or what is right for one person may not be right for another. And of course, this is what we call moral relativism. And those who say that moral relativism is okay, who am I to impose my morality on others is often the question that people ask. But the problem is we can't escape the imposition of morality or ethics on others. That's why we have prisons. That's why we want to protect people who are innocent civilians. But when we basically do what is right in our own eyes without regard for others, what ends up happening is we lose touch with actually what right and wrong is, that there are moral standards. And I'll give an example. I was at a conference and there was a young man with whom I was speaking, and he said, I used to be a moral relativist. I just did my own thing. I didn't care about other people. Of course, I had a girlfriend and she didn't want to be dating a moral relativist, because how can you commit yourself to someone who doesn't believe in commitment? How can you love someone who doesn't believe that there is such a thing as love and the duty to love and the obligation to love? So she broke up with me, and this really, upset me, and I kind of lost my way for a while because I really liked this girl. And, he said, I realized that truth and right and wrong matter, and that I had no character. I didn't care about other people. I was very selfish. And so people couldn't trust me. I couldn't make friendships. And, because friendship is built on trust. And if you break that trust, if you don't care about how you treat other people, if it's just a matter of what you prefer, then your life really, you lose touch with your own humanity. And so this person ended up following, he said he discovered the importance of truth and right and wrong. And so he ended up finding Jesus Christ, and who said, I am the truth, I am the way, I'm the life, etc. And so he ended up realizing that his own life needed direction, needed shaping. And as he became a Christian, he reconnected with actually this woman who had broken up with him, and they ended up getting married because she had seen such a change in his life. He had gone from being superficial, kind of a hollow person, to someone of substance, someone who was, who believed in commitment, who believed in right and wrong, who believed in the cultivation of character. And so this was, so it makes a difference, a very practical difference in how we treat others, how we cultivate friendships, whether we can be trustworthy people. That's part of ethics.
That's a great perspective. And that's a good example, because we're seeing in that specific scenario that ideas have consequences. If a person doesn't believe in commitment, then they can't have a relationship. And that's so practical. Every young adult can relate to that. And what comfort can we find in knowing that there is absolute truth? Like how you were saying that Jesus is the truth. Like what comfort can we find in that, especially in a world that is attacking us for standing on the absolute truth?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think in terms of not just right and wrong, but what happens when we violate moral standards. Well, a lot of us understand what it means to feel guilty about something. Well, how do we deal with the guilt in our own experience? How do we deal with shame in our own experience? And there are some people who have very troubled consciences. How do they address that? Human beings have gone wrong. We have broken this moral ideal. We don't live up to our own standards. So how do we deal with failure in our own lives? A lot of people say, oh, don't give me those moral ideals. But what ends up happening is that we start to accumulate a lot of guilt because we know we've done things that are wrong. We know we should say, I'm sorry to other people because we've wronged them. We need to ask for forgiveness from them. But when how do we actually do it when, we've actually committed private sins, things that seem so individual to us and maybe nobody else knows, but yet we are burdened by guilt? Well, ideas have consequences. If you believe that there is no such thing as right or wrong, but yet you feel this constant guilt, you don't have any resource for dealing with it. But Jesus said, come to me, you who are weary, I will give you rest. take my yoke, kind of this load, this light load upon you, that I will give. Yes, you have to follow me, but yet it's not a heavy burden to follow me. It is a light burden to follow Jesus. And so Jesus says, I will give you rest. A lot of us find we have restless souls, that we are not at peace with ourselves. Jesus promises to give us that peace, that rest, that forgiveness that we seek. There's a former atheist by the name of Francis Spufford who said that when he said, as an atheist, I could not deal with the guilt that I was carrying around. He said he grew up in a church, he left the church, but he found that it was actually in Jesus Christ that he could find forgiveness and freedom from that guilt that no other philosophical system could bring him. His own atheism could not bring that relief that he needed. He said, but I looked to Jesus and I found mercy. I needed it and I found it. And he said it was something that was powerful. It was something that was gigantic and forceful. Not the stuff that he'd grown up with. It was kind of sweet little Sunday school type morality lessons. This is something robust and tremendous and something that really transformed his life. So ideas indeed do have consequences. And a question that we have to ask all of ourselves is, how do I deal with that guilt? How do I deal with my moral failure? Jesus says he is the answer to that moral failure. He is the one who came to pay the penalty for our own moral failures so that we could be in right standing with God, that we could find that cleansed conscience, that forgiveness that we are all seeking.
Right. Thank you for just bringing up the gospel in all of this, because that's definitely the center point of what we're trying to focus on, is how the gospel informs us on right living. And as young adults, we definitely want to be in the right. We don't want to just be in the know and just know everything about the Bible and know what the right thing to do is, but to be in the right, as in we're actually living righteous lives for the Lord, because 2 Corinthians 5 says that we are the righteousness of God because Jesus died for us so that we can be the righteousness of God, because he is righteous. We're not perfect, but he's perfect. So I'm really thankful that you closed with the gospel in mind, and I think that we'll definitely benefit much from thinking these things through about how do ideas have consequences for us today. I think that with these truths in mind, we can build a proper ethic of engaging the world and in loving our neighbor and encouraging one another to stand on Christ. And like you said, it's not just about being this perfect person. It's about knowing what has been done for you in your place and being saved from sin and wanting to be out of the darkness and into the light, as we talked about in the last episode. But thank you for your perspective. And if you guys would like to learn more about Dr. Copan's work, he does have a website, paulcopan.com. And you can purchase some of his books on Amazon, and anything else that people can reach you on, Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter and Facebook, and they can, like you said, check out Amazon, and there are also resources at the website, articles and interviews and so forth. There's just a bunch of stuff on YouTube as well.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dr. Copan, and thank you guys for listening.